Welcome back to Grimverse History, where we uncover the strange and forgotten sides of history. Tonight, we step into the hidden chambers of the Ottoman Empire to uncover what really happened to harem wives accused of betrayal. What if I told you that execution was not the harshest fate a woman could face in the imperial harem? There was a crime so feared that even whispering its name could seal a woman's destiny. You push open a heavy wooden door. The air smells of warm oil lamps and damp stone. Your footsteps echo softly, swallowed by velvet curtains and marble corridors. If you enjoy falling asleep to the darker corners of history, gently like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey. It is the late medieval Ottoman world. The empire is powerful, orderly, and obsessed with control. Behind guarded gates lies the harem, not a place of romance, but of rules, surveillance, and fear. Mahid is 24 years old, and she is standing at the edge of the Bosphorus in the hour before dawn, watching the surface of the strait ripple with currents that have carried bodies to the sea for 300 years. Her wrists are bound behind her back with silk cord, the same silk that adorned her chambers when she was still a favorite of the Sultan. You stand close enough to hear the water moving below the stones. You can feel the cold in the air before the sun rises. When she slept on cushions embroidered with thread of gold and woke to servants who called her Light of the Harem, now she stands in a cotton shift, barefoot on stones, still wet from the night's tide, her hair unbound and tangled by the wind that sweeps down from the Black Sea. The shift is thin enough that she can feel the cold penetrating to her bones, thin enough that the men who surround her can see the outline of her body beneath it, but modesty no longer matters. Nothing that happened to her body from this moment forward would be witnessed by anyone who would survive to speak of it. She can smell the sweat of the men beside her, the mutes who serve the Bostan Khudao, the chief gardener whose actual duties have nothing to do with gardens. She can smell her own fear, sharp and animal, cutting through the perfumes that still cling to her skin from the hammam where she was washed and prepared for this moment. You notice how deliberate their movements are. Nothing here is rushed. They oiled her hair and scented her skin and dressed her in white, as if preparing her for a wedding rather than an execution. The rituals of the harem extended even to death. A woman who had shared the Sultan's bed, who had borne the possibility of royal children, could not be disposed of carelessly. Her destruction required ceremony. Beside her, on the stones, rests a sack, canvas, reinforced with leather at the seams, large enough to contain a human body. She has heard of these sacks since her first days in the harem, whispered about by older women who used them as warnings, as cautionary tales, as reminders of what happened to those who forgot their place. You hear it too now. You wish you didn't understand what those sounds mean. She has known since the moment the Sila al-Sat, the chief black eunuch, appeared at the door of her chamber with guards who did not speak. She knew when she was brought before the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who pronounced judgment without allowing defense. She knew when the silk cord was wrapped around her wrists and she was led through passages she had never seen before, down stairs that descended into the foundations of the palace, through gates that opened onto the waterfront where the boats of the condemned were moored. She will be sewn into the sack with the animals. The sack will be weighted with stones and thrown into the Bosphorus. She will sink into the black water while the starving cats claw at her flesh, while the snakes strike at whatever warmth they can find, while the weight drags her down into depths where no light penetrates. She will drown, but drowning will not be the worst of it. The worst will be the minutes before drowning, the chaos of animal terror combined with her own, the darkness and the cold and the creatures that share her final moments. This is the punishment for what she has been accused of doing, not convicted, accused. In the Ottoman harem, the accusation was the conviction. The Sultan's word was law, and the Sultan's mother spoke with the Sultan's voice in matters concerning the women of the palace. Mahid was accused of betraying the Sultan with a palace guard. She was accused of violating the most fundamental rule of the harem, the rule that made the entire system possible, the certainty that every child born to a Sultan's woman was the Sultan's child. She was accused of contaminating the bloodline that had ruled the Ottoman Empire for 200 years. She was innocent. She had never touched the guard she was accused of taking as a lover. She had never touched any man except the Sultan himself. The man who had called her to his bed perhaps 24 times over, the 3 years she had been a concubine of the imperial household. But her innocence was irrelevant. What mattered was that another woman, a rival who wanted her gone, had whispered the right words to the right ears. What mattered was that the Valley's Sultan believed, or chose to believe, or found it convenient to believe. What mattered was that Mahidevran had failed to produce a son in 3 years, making her expendable, making her removal a matter of housekeeping rather than tragedy. She thinks of her mother, who sold her to slave traders when she was 12 years old, because the family needed money for her brother's apprenticeship. She thinks of the years in the training house, learning the arts that would make her valuable. Music, poetry, dance, conversation, the 1,000 skills required of women who would serve in the houses of the powerful. She thinks of the day she was purchased for the imperial harem, the day she thought her fortune had been made, the day she entered Topkapi Palace, believing she was ascending to a life of unimaginable luxury. You stand at the edge of the stone corridor watching from the shadows. You can smell the damp marble beneath your feet. You hear the faint echo of water somewhere beyond the walls, flowing as it always has, indifferent. She had not understood then what the luxury cost. She had not understood that the golden cage was still a cage, that the silk-lined walls could become a prison, that the same system that elevated her could destroy her on the word of a jealous competitor. She understands now. The Bostang Fudat approaches. He is a large man, his authority visible in his bearing. His face is expressionless in the way men who conduct state murders learn to keep their faces. He nods to the mutes who stand beside Mahidevran, and they grip her arms, lifting her slightly off the stones. You see her feet leave the ground. You realize no one will stop what comes next. You may speak. The Bostang Fudat says, if you have final words, you may speak them now. Mahidevran considers. She could protest her innocence again. She could curse the rival who betrayed her. She could beg for mercy that will not be granted. She could pray to Allah for forgiveness of sins she did not commit. Instead, she speaks the truth that will be buried with her in the black water of the Bosphorus. I was never unfaithful, she says. I loved the Sultan. I would have given him sons if he had given me the chance. What is done to me tonight is murder, not justice. The Bostang Fudat's expression does not change. He has heard such words before. Every woman who faces this death proclaims her innocence. Some of them are lying. The Bostang Fudat with his mute executioners, the Kitla Atsa, who served as prosecutor and judge, the Valide Sultan, whose authority over the harem made her the most powerful woman in the empire, and the most dangerous enemy any concubine could have. You are meant to see this. You are meant to understand it. You will learn why other women of the harem were forced to witness these punishments. The entire system of reproductive control that made the harem not merely a household, but a machine for producing legitimate heirs while destroying any possibility of illegitimate ones, because you cannot understand what happened to Mahidevran without understanding the system that killed her and the logic that made her death seem necessary to those who ordered it. The Ottoman harem was not what Western imagination has typically portrayed. It was not primarily a collection of sexual playthings maintained for imperial pleasure, though that element certainly existed. It was fundamentally a political institution designed to solve a problem that had plagued every dynasty in human history: how to ensure a legitimate succession, while preventing the conflicts that competing heirs inevitably created. The problem was acute for the Ottomans because of their particular combination of circumstances. They were an absolute monarchy, with all power concentrated in the person of the Sultan. They practiced a form of succession that did not automatically favor the eldest son, meaning that any son might potentially inherit the throne, and they ruled an empire so vast and wealthy that the stakes of succession were almost unimaginably high. These conditions created a recipe for civil war. If multiple princes survived to adulthood, they would inevitably compete for the throne. That competition would divide the empire, weaken its military capacity, invite intervention by foreign powers, potentially destroy everything the dynasty had built. The Ottomans developed two complementary solutions to this problem. The first solution was fratricide. When a new sultan ascended the throne, he was expected, and eventually required by law, learn to execute all his brothers. This practice, formalized by Sultan Mehmed I in the 15th century, eliminated competing claims by the simplest method imaginable. By eliminating the competitors themselves, the new sultan's brothers were strangled with silk bowstrings, a method that shed no blood. A method considered appropriately dignified for royal persons. Their bodies were then buried with honors, their potential threat to stability removed. You hear no cries recorded in the chronicles. You are meant to understand that silence was the point. The second solution was the harem system. By controlling all reproductive access to the sultan, the harem ensured that only authorized children would be born. Every woman who might potentially bear a royal child was confined within the palace, watched constantly. Her sexuality was managed by officials whose job was to know exactly when and with whom she had intercourse. No uncertainty about paternity could be permitted. The bloodline had to be pure. These two solutions were connected. Fratricide was possible only because the harem made it possible to know exactly who the sultan's sons were. Without certainty about paternity, the killing of brothers would become genocide of all possible relatives, a practice even the Ottomans found impractical. And so the harem's extreme punishments for infidelity were not excesses, they were necessities, because the stakes of an illegitimate birth were unbearably high. A child of uncertain paternity might claim the throne. That claim might succeed. You realize now why doubt itself was treated as treason. An impostor might rule the Ottoman Empire, breaking the sacred bloodline that gave the dynasty its legitimacy. The entire system of succession, and the stability of the largest Islamic empire in the world, depended on absolute certainty that no such contamination could occur. This is why the punishments were so severe. This is why accusations were effectively convictions. This is why innocent women died alongside guilty ones. Why the system always erred on the side of elimination, rather than risk the cost of false positive, innocent women killed, was acceptable. The cost of false negatives, illegitimate children born, was catastrophic. The harem structure reflected these imperatives. At the top stood the Valid Sultan, the sultan's mother, ruler of the harem, with authority second only to the sultan himself. She had survived the system. She had borne a son who lived to take the throne. She had watched her son's brothers strangled, and she had accepted this as necessary. You understand now why mercy was not her role. She understood exactly what the stakes were, and exactly what measures were required to manage them. Below the Validi Sultan were the sultan's legal wives, the cadens, of whom there could be no more than 4. According to Islamic law, these women possessed formal status, legal rights, recognized positions within the imperial hierarchy. Their children were legitimate heirs. They could not be easily disposed of. Punishing a caden required process, justification, consideration of political consequences. Below the cadens were the concubines, the eyeballs, and the ondes, women who had attracted the sultan's attention, who had been called to his bed, but who had not been elevated to the status of legal wife. These women were more numerous, more expendable, more vulnerable. They possessed fewer protections. Their deaths required less justification. Below the concubines were the carriettes, the general population of the harem women who served in countless capacities, who had not yet attracted imperial attention. Some of these women would rise, most would not. They were the labor force of the harem. The servants and attendants who made the institution function, and threaded through this hierarchy were the eunuchs. Men who had been castrated specifically to serve in spaces where unmodified men could not be trusted. The black eunuchs, the Sitla Atsa and his subordinates, administrators of the harem, enforcers of its rules, investigators of its violations. You begin to see the shape of the machine, and to understand why, once a woman was accused, there was rarely a way out alive. The white eunuchs served in other capacities throughout the palace. Together they formed a quiet bureaucracy of observation, a system of eyes and reports that monitored every aspect of a woman's existence. This was the system Mahidevran entered when she was purchased for the imperial household at the age of 14. This was the world whose rules she learned to navigate over the following decade. A world where survival depended not on innocence, but on silence, compliance, and favor. You begin to understand that nothing in her life was ever truly private. Now, let us return to the waterfront, where Mahidevran stands before the canvas sack that will become her final enclosure. The mutes approach with the calm efficiency of men performing a familiar duty. One holds the opening steady, others guide her forward. Her resistance changes nothing. You look away instinctively, but the sound of fabric shifting pulls you back. She is lowered carefully into the sack feet first. The movement disturbs what has already been placed inside. She feels sudden motion against her legs, living forms reacting in confusion to the narrowing space. The darkness closes in as the sack rises around her body. Her voice disappears into the thick canvas. The outside world becomes distant. She is folded inward, drawn into herself, unable to move freely, unable to shield herself from what surrounds her. You sense the panic before you hear it. Within the sack, the confined creatures respond only with instinct. They seek warmth. They seek escape. They react to contact with contact of their own. Mahidevran feels pressure, movement, the tightening presence of other bodies, sharing the same shrinking air. Then the opening is closed, the final seam drawn tight, the outside sealed away. Weights are attached below, not with cruelty, but with practiced precision. She is lifted, carried, the gentle rocking of footsteps adding to the confusion within. You hear the water long before she touches it. She cannot see the surface, only feels the sudden lightness, the moment when the world tilts. Then cold, the Bosphorus receives the sack without sound. Water seeps through the canvas slowly, replacing air, replacing warmth. Inside, movement grows frantic, then disordered, then weaker. Mahidevran's body reacts as all bodies do, seeking breath where none remains. The water does the rest. Not with rage, not with spectacle, but with inevitability. And when the surface closes above her, the empire's logic remains intact, pure, undisturbed. She drowns in darkness, surrounded by other living beings that are losing breath alongside her. Her final sensations blur together. Cold, pressure, confusion, and the quiet certainty that no one will ever know what happened to her in these final moments. The sack sinks. The current takes it. By the time the sun rises over the Bosphorus, there will be no trace that Mahidevran ever existed. The drowning of women in sacks was not the only method the Ottomans used to punish those accused of infidelity. It was not even the most common, but it was among the most feared, reserved for cases, judged especially threatening, or when the punishment itself needed to speak louder than words. The history of this punishment predates the Ottoman Empire. Drowning in a sack with animals was practiced by the Romans. They called it poena kole, the punishment of the sack. It was reserved for those who murdered their parents. The Ottomans adopted and adapted this practice, applying it to women whose sexual transgressions were framed as crimes against dynastic continuity. Acts viewed not as private betrayals, but as symbolic assaults on the bloodline itself. The choice of animals was deliberate. Cats represented domestic betrayal. Creatures of the household turned against their keeper. Snake symbolized corruption. The feared contamination of purity introduced by infidelity. Together, they created a death that was not only final, but symbolic. A punishment shaped to fit the crime as Ottoman jurisprudence defined it. The Bosphorus was the preferred location for these drownings, for both practical and symbolic reasons. Practically, its strong currents carried bodies into the Sea of Marmara, and eventually toward the open Mediterranean. Recovery became impossible. Symbolically, the Bosphorus marked the boundary between Europe and Asia. The heart of the Ottoman world, the waterway Constantinople had controlled for 1,000 years. To drown there was to be rejected by the empire itself, cast out from the center of civilization into forgetting. Other methods were used for women of different rank or different accusations. The silent bowstring was reserved for persons of royal blood, including the Sultan's legal wives, his sisters, and his daughters. This method was carried out quietly by mute executioners, men who could never speak of what they witnessed. The bowstring was considered more honorable than drowning. It was quicker, less prolonged, and allowed the body to remain intact for proper burial. Legal wives, who were convicted of infidelity, if they were convicted at all, usually faced this fate rather than the sack. But such convictions were rare. The political consequences of executing a Gotnay were severe. Extraordinary justification was required. More often, wives who fell from favor were divorced, sent to the old palace, a separate residence, where former favorites and elderly women of the harem spent their remaining years. Their exile was permanent. But it was comfortable. Concubines had fewer protections. They could be drowned, strangled, poisoned, or simply removed. Often without formal process, many were sold to other households. Their departure recorded in archives using polite language that concealed the true cause. Others were married to officials or soldiers, disposed of through gifts that transformed risk into loyalty. The surviving records show variation. Punishments shifted from reign to reign. Severity rose and fell with politics, personality, and fear. But the logic never changed. The system always valued certainty over mercy. The journey slows now. Somewhere far behind us, oil lamps flicker against stone. As you listen, you may feel the distance closing. The marble corridors dissolve. The Bosphorus becomes only a memory. And, slowly, gently, you are guided back to yourself. If this quiet journey stayed with you, if these forgotten shadows felt meaningful, you are welcome to support the channel. A gentle, like a quiet share, or a soft subscription, so we can wander again into history's darker corners together. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and we will meet again.